Hey guys, welcome back to another video. In January 2018, I went for my JET interview, and I have posted a video before about my experience with the interview. I made the video with Tanya. It was probably about this time last year. Whenever I gave people my list of questions, I would tell them to word some of them differently or throw in a wild question and stuff.
Wild card.
What the? I stumbled across a list of all of the questions which I used at the time to practice for my interview. So in this video I'm going to go over my practice questions, how I used them, how they're organized and why, as well as a few extra tips at the end. If you find the information in this video useful, please give the video a like, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already to see more videos like this about the JET program. Before I get into it, I just want to reiterate, it was 2018 that I interviewed. I don't know when you're watching this and how much the interview process has changed since then. This is just what I did at the time, so you know, take it with a pinch of salt. Also, I interviewed in the UK in case it wasn't obvious from my accent, so I don't know if the interview is different in America or in other countries that JET exists within, but I can't imagine it will be wildly different. So let's get started. So the way I've organized these questions, or how I did organize them a few years ago now, was I blocked them into sort of broader categories, and a lot of the questions within each category are very similar, and you can use a lot of the answers from one question for another as well. But the key sort of tactic here is to, with all of these more general topics, you should be able to talk about them without even being prompted with a question. You should be very comfortable and familiar talking about these wider topics in a conversation form, or just even as if you're giving a presentation, so you know it like the back of your hand. Not parrot memorizing it, really knowing how to talk about those bigger topics. And that way, no matter what question you're asked, no matter how it's worded, you'll know exactly what they're asking for, which category it applies to, and you'll be able to take an answer you're familiar with and apply it, because you really don't know what they're going to ask you exactly. So the key is to be very comfortable talking about these broader topics and practice with people. Have people interview you. Give them this list of questions or your list of questions and have them ask you. Just say to them, choose one or maybe two questions from each kind of category, but ask them to change the wording of the questions, to maybe ask their own question, throw you a curveball, a follow-up. And basically I would time my practice interviews because I would want them to last 15 to 20 minutes, because that's roughly how long your interview will last, and just do it again and again and again and again, so you are as comfortable as you can be with these topics. The first set of questions are questions on you as a person, because they're going to want to get to know you. Can you introduce yourself? Tell me something about yourself. What are some of your hobbies? Talk about a challenge you had to overcome. What are your best or worst qualities, and how did you hear about JET? So they're not all directly about you as a person, but you do need to be able to talk about yourself, and that list also includes some kind of general interview questions that wouldn't be specific to JET interviews. But you can use all of these questions as an opportunity to showcase what you are good at. But you know, they're not going to ask you all of these, they'll just ask a couple. It's good to have answers to different ways of being asked about yourself, so instantly when you hear the question you can think, okay, they're asking me to talk about myself, I can showcase a strength here. So I wrote in my list the big three, in which one of these questions I figured you're almost certainly going to be asked, and that is, so why do you want to go to Japan rather than elsewhere? Why did you apply for the JET program rather than another program? And why are you applying as an ALT? Or why do you want to become an ALT? I didn't want to just have an answer practiced and prepared for why Japan, because they may ask it slightly differently. Why JET? Why an ALT? And all the answers may be similar, but my point is you need to practice with variations of all of these questions, so when they ask you, you're not going to be mentally frozen or blocked or panic because it's not exactly how you imagined it being asked. You will likely have addressed these questions somewhat in your statement of purpose, and they will have your application in front of you, so make sure you know your application and your statement of purpose inside out. I also just wrote questions specific to your statement of purpose, so as I said, you should know this well, because they may ask you, oh, why did you write about X? Can you expand on this or follow up on that or something like that? So again, just know your application. So when I formed this list a few years ago now, I was basically browsing loads of YouTube videos and forums and stuff where people had talked about their interviews, and I kind of compiled a list from that of any even remotely possible question. I heard mixed things about this next kind of question: classroom questions / mock lesson improvisation. I heard online that people are sometimes asked, can you act as if you're doing a self-introduction lesson now for 2 minutes, okay, go, kind of thing. And this didn't happen to me or a lot of people from what I've seen. I don't know if they maybe only ask that kind of question in certain countries. But I'll go through the list anyway, because there are other kinds of classroom related questions too. If you had to do a cultural lesson on your home country, what would be 3 things you would talk about? Can you do a mock lesson on sports or another topic or something like that? Can you do a 2-minute class self-introduction? Right now. What are 3 things from your home country you'd bring to Japan, you know, to show your students? What games might you play with your classes? Can you show us how you would run this? Teach us about a holiday you have in your home country. What would you do if a student asks you an uncomfortable question, for example about relationships or your salary? How will you work together with your Japanese colleagues? If your students have a very low level of English, how will you communicate with or teach them? So some of these questions you're not improvising and sort of acting, but some of them you are. Don't freak out if you are asked something like this, because I think that what they're looking for here is not to show that you are a good teacher, because you know, you don't need teaching experience to apply. They know how much teaching experience you have from your application. What they're looking for here is how you act under pressure. So as long as you remain confident and keep your cool and just act natural and have a good flow, that's going to come across well, no matter what you say really. And I think it's the same with a lot of these classroom related questions. It's about showing how you would act under pressure. These are less about how you would act and more about how you do act in the interview in that moment. Questions about adaptability / difficult situations. How would you feel if you were placed in an isolated or rural area? How would you overcome culture shock? How will you deal with stress? And for this one I said as an example, but this could happen at any point, interviewers may try to throw curveballs throughout the interview. For example, if you say that you go to the gym to deal with stress, what if they follow up with, what if you're in a tiny rural area and there is no gym? So you know, it's good to, when you have people practice this interview with you, ask them to ask you follow-up questions and throw you some curveballs, because you need to have practice preparing for the unexpected. Is there anything that could bring you down while living in Japan? How would you handle difficult times or situations in Japan? How will you respond to possible prejudice and negative stereotypes from Japanese people? If you overheard teachers talking about you in a way you didn't like, how would you react? How would you react if your class teacher goes out and leaves the rest of the class to you? If there was some form of discipline in the classroom you didn't agree with, how would you react? I mean, you know what adaptability is. I'm sure that you showed examples of that in your application. Try not to just parrot read out what you wrote in your application though, because they've already seen that. Expand on something or give a new example. Cultural experience questions. So tell me about your cultural experience or your study abroad. Or how can you use what you learned there for JET? If you've written about a cultural experience in your application, they may well ask about that, be able to expand upon that, be able to try and link it back to the goals of the JET program, maybe something like this. Questions on internationalization, so directly about the main goals of the JET program. How would you involve yourself in the community outside of teaching? How will you represent your home country while in Japan, at school, in the broader community? What can you give back to Japan for your time teaching after the JET program? Would you be prepared to take part in after-school activities? So all of these very directly are about the goals of the JET program. So you need to be able to comfortably talk about this. You know, just in general, just talk about it to someone, have a conversation about it, because you can use most of what you'll say and apply it to any of these questions. And finally, other. Do you know about any current or recent affairs between Japan and your home country? What are some current or recent news affairs in Japan that you are aware of? I've heard people be asked, like, do you know the names of the main islands in Japan, and very specific, almost trivia-like questions. I didn't get that. I don't know if people actually get asked that kind of stuff, but I think, you know, it's good to have a basic knowledge of things about Japan, current news in Japan, and be familiar with it if there's any links between your home country and Japan at the moment, because even if they don't ask you about that directly, if you find a way to fit that into another answer, it shows how, you know, on the ball you are. At the end of my list of questions, I also wrote questions for interviewers. This is so important. They will ask you, do you have any questions for us? And the key here is not to ask any questions which you can find online very easily, the information, if you just search it. And don't ask questions about like money and stuff like that. Like, that's just common sense. You should ask questions which you are taking advantage of the situation in, like questions that only they might know the answer to. One of my interviewers was an ex-Jet, so I asked him about how much his Japanese improved while he was in Japan and that kind of thing. But whatever you do, don't ask nothing. That's just not a good vibe. So you may not want to use all of those, you may want to add your own or whatever, but even if you don't use any of that, I recommend you do something similar. Also, with that last category where they might ask you about current affairs in Japan or whatever, I think it's just good in general to have a list of things prepared. So I dug out these old papers and notes I made for myself. I don't remember what all of them mean because it was 2 years ago I wrote them, but I'll tell you what they say and you can interpret them how you like. So I made a list of possible classroom topics. I made a list of news stories or talking points in my country and in Japan. I made a list of 5 transferable skills that I have. I made a list of 5 positive and 5 negative personality traits that I have that are also positives in disguise as negatives. I made a list of 5 reasons to visit my country, and I said this one's really important because in Japan people will want to know about your country. I wrote leave mega early. You know, you don't want to be late for that interview. I went ridiculously early. Went and got a coffee, I went to Starbucks or something, and that really relaxed me kind of before the interview, so I recommend something like that. I said answer every question with thought, so take a few seconds to think. You don't need to answer immediately. Working with kids examples, I did have some very small experience working with kids. Show an interest in Japanese culture, so have things prepared. Be ready with a few stories from your time abroad. This is a good point actually. Rather than ramble, did that answer your question? You can ask them, if you feel yourself rambling, cut yourself off and just look at them and say, did that answer your question? And they can ask a follow-up, and if they're satisfied with it, they'll tell you, and then you can stop. Because rambling and rambling and rambling just kind of makes you seem nervous, you know? Get specific with your answers. Try not to give very general, wishy-washy answers that could be applied to like any question in the world. I know I've said you have answers that can apply to everything, but my point is you'll have a bank of stories and examples and stuff which are specific, and you can know instantly which ones to pull out and apply to the question you're asked. Smile. And if it's appropriate, go and shake hands with the interviewers. That'll show that you're confident and positive, and obviously make sure to thank them at the end. I really hope that you guys found this video useful and that you'll be able to use it for your own preparations and that you nail that interview and make it to Japan. And who knows, maybe I will see you around next summer. Comment down below if you have a different tactic of preparing. I'm curious to hear about it. Until next week,